thank you, everybody. Please, sorry to interrupt, but please continue eating, enjoying your, you should be on dessert by now, maybe not, but please do continue eating, and there'll be coffee coming around. I think it's coming around now, so enjoy your coffee. But we want to get started with our program, so we have enough time for our speaker and enough time for question and answers afterwards. I'm Keith Richburg, the president of the club, so thank you all for being here. It's great to be back with our events here in the main dining room. Fingers crossed we can continue with that. Before we get to today's event, just want to let you know, please keep an eye on your email in case you don't, or if you don't check your email from the FCC, make sure you click it so it doesn't go into your spam basket or somewhere else so you can actually see it, because we've got great events coming up and we don't want you to miss any. We don't want things to be sold out because you didn't see it on time. Or just make a point of checking fcchk.org to make sure you know about all of our upcoming events. For example, the coming Monday, we have an FCC screening of a feature film called Hong Kong 1942, which is a film about espionage, love, and intrigue during the Japanese occupation. So since this is 2022 and it's a film about 1942, we thought that would be appropriate. And we've got some really good ones coming up, which I shouldn't tell you about now because it'll be sold out right away. But you'll definitely want to sign up for that. Keep an eye on your email. Keep an eye on fcchk.org for those. Also, don't forget, we've got quiz night also coming up on the 25th. So if you want to test your trivia knowledge, make sure you sign up. Get yourself a team together. And we're going to have we're taking only a little bit of a hiatus for August, and we're going to come back strong in September. So please do make sure you keep an eye on upcoming events. But for today, we're going to talk about a country that's dear to my heart, the Philippines. It's a place where I started my career as a foreign correspondent before most of you I'm looking at were born, because I started there in 1986 as a foreign correspondent, so I've got over 30 years of interest and love for the place. But as the title of today's talk asked the question, why is it where it is? Why is it the most un-Asian country of all the Asian countries I visited? Why is it that they speak English and they speak Tagalog, which is a language that's not like the other languages of the Malay Peninsula? Why is it that they're Catholic, the only majority Catholic country in the region? And why do they have this interesting history? We're going to find out about a lot of that and more, including what's going on in contemporary politics, from Philip Bowring, who's the author of the Pieces of Jigsaw State, which is for sale over here, by the way. And Philip Bowring, I think most of you know, it's very rare that I get to say someone needs no introduction, but I think with Philip Bowring that is the case. Twice president of the Foreign Correspondents Club, a journalist who first, I believe, came to Hong Kong. He can correct me if I'm wrong, for the Financial Times, and later became editor of the Far Eastern Economic Review. This is his third or fourth book, he has told me, depending on how you count them. He can explain that. And this one, as I mentioned, is for sale here. We're getting close into the holiday gift-giving season, so if you're looking for an interesting, good historical read, his book will be for sale, and Philip will be behind to sign a few copies for it. And full disclosure, I was actually one of the early readers of the proofs of the book, and I can tell you it's a cracking, rip-roaring read. So without further ado, I'll get Philip Bowring on the stage, and he'll speak first, and then we'll have Q&A afterwards.
Keith, thank you very much for the introduction. I'm going to get straight into talking about my book, because it's mostly about history rather than today, but you can ask me about today as well later. But first I must make an apology to all Filipinos present that I had the temerity to actually write a book about their country without ever actually having lived there, though I have been there on many occasions since 1973. So I think we need to start with a little bit of geography. The Philippines is almost unique in one way. Apart from a couple of bits of Indonesia, Sulawesi, and a couple of other islands, Philippines sits between the Sahel Shelf and the Sunda Shelf, which are two great land masses of the Northern Hemisphere. So it is unique in its geography, and its geography is also determined by the fact that it sits at this juncture of several plates, geological plates, which gave rise, have given rise, still give rise to volcanoes, and it is the volcanoes which created, a long time ago, of course, the islands which comprise the Philippines today. So the Philippines is actually the most fragmented, geographically, major country in the world. I mean, there are some island territories that are a bit more fragmented, but this is more fragmented than, for example, Indonesia. The second bit of geography I think we understand is just how far it is from north to south in the Philippines, from northern Luzon, which has a climate very similar to Hong Kong, to Davao and Zamboanga, where you're in a truly tropical climate. And this has had huge implications over time for the fact that, you know, for long, northern Luzon or central Luzon was the most developed part of the country, but maybe the opportunities for the future lie more in Mindanao and the southern areas. The thing which people really miss about the Philippines, linguistically and culturally, this is a central part of Austronesia. Austronesia, the great language cultural group, which extends from Taiwan to the Hawaii, to New Zealand, to Madagascar, and includes the whole of, almost the whole of Indonesia, Malaysia, and a few other bits and pieces here and there. So the languages of the Philippines, they were all Austronesian languages. They're all related to Malay and Javanese and so on. So although there is this diversity of languages, there is actually a common cultural heritage. And probably the Philippines is closer to that original Austronesian cultural heritage than anywhere else. Now that may seem surprising because everybody talks about Spanish influence and American influence and all this foreign conquest. But actually, you don't have to look very far below the surface to realize there's a lot of superficial aspects to those influences. The perhaps more significant fact is that most of Asia and Austronesia was heavily influenced by Indian culture and language and religion. Philippines was only slightly influenced. There were settlements that you can see in Butuan in northern Mindanao and in Manila, near Manila, which date back to the time of Javanese and Srivijayan empires, 1,000, 1,200 years ago. But that was relatively small compared with the influence that these same Indian influences had in say, Java or Sumatra or Thailand. So this is, in a way, the original Austronesia. Now, but it was also the Austronesia which was at the end of Asia, because people didn't cross the Pacific. Trade was all within Southeast Asia or between Southeast Asia and the Arab world, or even with Rome. But nobody ventured across the Pacific. So from that perspective of the time, Philippines, the islands were on the fringe of maritime Asia. But nonetheless, they were very much part of Asian Austronesia. Then along comes Spain. There's two things about Spain. First of all, if we look at a map of 1600, we find that the Philippines, as it currently exists, it's all there on the map as claimed by Spain. The fact that Spain didn't really occupy a lot of it, besides the point, it was there identified in the maps, European maps of that time. Now, if you think 1600, if you look at a map of China, Ming Dynasty, end of the Ming era. China doesn't really expand north of the Great Wall, doesn't include Manchuria, Mongolia, Xinjiang, Tibet, Taiwan. So you can see that there is a sort of historical unity to the Philippines, which is rather, in a way, curious, given the fact that, today, Philippines seems a rather fragmented country, which indeed it is. What did the Spanish do with it? Well, they mainly used it as a sort of way of spreading Christianity. Some people made a lot of money with the galleon trade, bringing silver to Manila and trading it for Chinese and Japanese goods. But actually, most of the ruling of the islands that the Philippines occupied was done by the friars, by the religious orders. So there used to be a phrase that Philippines had spent 400 years in a convent and 50 years in Hollywood. Actually, this is complete nonsense, because if you read what the Spanish friars and others had to say about the Philippines, was that they could build churches and they could get people to attend ceremonies and singing and dancing for the church and so on, but they couldn't control their sexual activities. And there's a huge literature about this, and it's actually something that repeats itself through all descriptions of the Philippines by foreigners. In fact, right up to today, because the fact is that at no time in the Philippines have more than about 70% of births been outside marriage, have been inside marriage. And at present it's about 50%. So you're looking at kind of something which has been going on for many years, and actually reflects an underlying Austronesian cultural trait, which, if you compare Philippines, what the Spanish wrote about the Philippines, what was being written both by Chinese and by the Dutch about Taiwan in the early 17th century, i.e. before the settlement of Taiwan by many mainlanders. So, there's this sort of curious situation where Philippines remains this sort of bulwark of Austronesian actual culture, even overlaid with Christianity and there's even, you certainly did find it even in Muslim Mindanao. It's probably changed a bit because of the influence of radical Islam, but that's a relatively recent phenomenon. Anyway, the Spanish were very lousy rulers of these islands. This is well attested by writers from French explorer La Pérouse. There was Alexander Dalrymple, a British East India Company person who drew all the maps around of the region and so on. They're contemptuous of Spanish rule of the Philippines. But one thing that did begin to happen in the 19th century was the emergence in the Philippines, because some plantations began to, there was some investment by a few foreigners, mainly British, in sugar development and so on. You get rise of a mestizo class, a sort of upper middle class of locally born mixed blood people, some Chinese, some Spanish mixture. And these people become the leaders of the what you could call the Philippine Revolution, to overthrow Spanish rule. And of course, the most famous name in that era, we're talking about the second half of the 19th century, was Rizal. Rizal was not really a revolutionary, but he had revolutionary ideas. Here was an intellectual from Binan near Manila, schooled in Europe, but who developed the idea of modern Asian nationalism, before really anywhere else. Because if you looked at other parts of colonized Asia at that time, you would see that the colonizers had effectively got the support of the old local aristocracy. So if you look at Indonesia, if you look at Malaysia, you find that the foreigners were largely ruling through the old elites. So the Philippines was first to have a new class of would-be leaders who wanted to get rid of the Spanish. Unfortunately, two things happened. They started their revolution. They were divided between different factions, Aguinaldo and Bonifacio, and Aguinaldo had Bonifacio killed and so on. And then, although they probably would have been successful against the Spanish, then along come the Americans, of course, in the Spanish-American War, consequence of which is that the Americans want to take control of the Philippines. The Americans run quite a brutal war, but quite a short one. And after they've won, the Americans being very half-hearted, in fact, a lot of people opposed to being, this colonization, said, well, we better, better do something, and we better be paternalistic, and we better help local people, and so we must devolve power to at least, to the locals, at least some of the locals. So what they did was actually they co-opted very successfully most of the generation which had supported Aguinaldo. So you find that the names which, the first president of, actually the Commonwealth of Philippines, which gained self-government from the US in 1935, so it's only, 37 years after the Americans took over. He had been an officer in Aguinaldo's army, but who then sort of, became involved in local politics at a time when there was a vote, but only a tiny proportion of the people had the vote. And even when, as the franchises expanded, the vote, not many people voted even when they could, because, they simply, most decisions were made by, local leaders. So the power structure, which had sort of devolved partly from later Spanish period of the growth of the mestizo class of landowners and senior officials and so on, this simply carried on into the new political system that the Americans brought. Very effective in a way in ensuring that the development of the Philippines is actually quite peaceful after the initial invasion, and there wasn't really much opposition, and the Americans introduced English in place of Spanish, and they had brought in education and public health and so on and so forth. So, there was and of course they brought in the legal system, and they brought in just American ways of doing things, which were essentially decentralized. You did not have in the American system a strong central bureaucracy. So as a result, if you don't have a strong central bureaucracy and you don't have many colonizers to come and impose your will, you have to rely entirely on the local landowners, the local power brokers. So that's pretty much what happened. And we come to 1941, and the Japanese appear on the scene and rather rapidly take over the Philippines. Of course, it's a very short duration occupation, but it reveals, one thing, or actually two things, so that roughly half of the elite were quickly co-opted into the Japanese system. I mean, the most sort of pro-Japanese of the political leaders in 41 was Benigno Aquino, the father of the late assassinated and subsequently his Aquino, two presidents Aquino. Anyway, the president under the Japanese, appointed by the Japanese, was José Laurel, who went on to become a candidate for president, failed candidate, I have to say, for president, after the end of the war. So you had this situation during the war of some people opposing the Japanese, some people leaving. I mean, Quezon left for the US. So at the end of the war, what happens? Well, they're supposed to be going to, get a lot of these guys like Laurel and Aquino for treason, but in fact, of course, they don't really want to, because they're all, it's all part of a lot of them are intermarried, families and so on. They don't want to have to go through that. So, the people who emerged from politics after the Japanese occupation and then independence in 1946, they're very much the same group of people who were, in charge before. So this was Japan was an interregnum which didn't really affect very much. All it did was give certain people, and including one Ferdinand Marcos, the chance to claim all kinds of things of daring deeds against the Japanese. Awarded lots of medals and so on and so forth. This has subsequently proved to be in complete hogwash. He did run something in Ilocos Norte, but it seems to have been as much about smuggling as it was actually about fighting the Japanese. Indeed, he had no particular reason to fight the Japanese because José Laurel, the president under the Japanese, had been the man who found him not guilty of a political assassination. So there was a certain interest between these two parties. But nonetheless, I mean, Ferdinand was very successful in creating a history of his war record and his medals, which wasn't actually debunked until much later. So that's so we get to this period after the war where you have these traditional local ruling families, some of them becoming important at the central level. They divided into two main political parties. There was some ideological difference between the liberals and the nationalists, but it wasn't very great, but there was some. You had a policy which was basically restrictive of foreign investment and quite protective of local business interests. It was a system which sort of worked in a rough and ready way, but also was accompanied by a lot of political violence and people with private armies and so on and so forth. So the Philippines, having in 1946, having been in a better condition than was any place in Southeast Asia, Singapore, was moving rather slowly relative to what was happening elsewhere in terms of social and economic development. So along comes Ferdinand Marcos in 1972 with his declaration of martial law. The objective being, as proclaimed at the time, to make Philippines a better governed, more centrally governed, stronger state with well-defined economic objectives and so on and so forth, and promising things like land reform to reduce the amount of friction between landowners and the peasantry. A lot of people, thought it was a good idea at the time, and Marcos actually had some quite excellent ministers, particularly in the economic front. So, for 4 or 5 years, Philippines seemed to be, going quite well. At least an improvement, perhaps, seen by some, despite the oppression, political oppression, improvement on what had been going on before. However, Marcos never really did what he promised to do in terms of getting rid of corruption. He simply changed the nature of corruption. He centralized corruption, brought in a whole lot of new players, and he also indulged in all kinds of fancy, projects, helped along, of course, by his wife Imelda, who's so the result was that over time, the Philippines became a very indebted country, and the banking and corporate structures that Marcos had helped to develop, who were basically mostly either his friends or people who paid him sufficient kickbacks to be allowed to enjoy monopolies of one sort or another. The country became too deeply indebted, and we had two years in succession before he fell of the economy actually contracting. So this was what gave rise to the events of 1986, the EDSA rebellion and the overthrow of Marcos and Aquino's widow, Corey, being thrust into the presidency. So, we are sort of back to square one in a way. There's a new constitution, but it's not that different from the old one. The same families are there. There is, because there's a return of representative government and voting and so on, the communist insurgency, which is mainly in Central Luzon, but also in Bicol and bits of northern Luzon and in Mindanao, that tended to fade under the new circumstances. And so for a while, you had the return of most of the names of the past, but there were new figures, and the most obvious one was Fidel Ramos, who had been the head of Philippine Constabulary during martial law, but was of a rather different type than most of Marcos's associates. And you had, though, at the same time, the political system shifted in one way. In one way, it didn't shift at all, because the same people were being elected as representatives of different provinces and so on, as had always been the case. But at the presidential and to some extent Senate level, you had the rise of personalities, film personalities, sports personalities, and so on and so forth. So this, you see this in the fact that Estrada's presidency, of course, Estrada in the end was removed because he wasn't much liked by many in the elite and for his behavior, but the domination of personality at the presidential level was, to a much higher level than it had been before, and the role of parties really ceased to have any meaning, because, I mean, although there were a lot of parties, people kept changing parties and merging and unmerging and so on and so forth, and that remains the case today. So among these personalities, I mean, we have Noynoy Aquino, who's simply elected on the sympathy vote for when his mother dies. And that you go from that to Duterte, elected in 2016, on the basis that he's a new strongman, promising to be completely different from the rest of from the predecessors and from the elite. But of course, Duterte was a local elite personified. In fact, he was the person who represented, in a way, something which started to happen under the Commonwealth and continued in the 1940s and 50s in particular. And that was internal colonization. The movement of people from Luzon and Visayas, and particularly Visayas, into Mindanao. It was relatively underpopulated and had lots of empty land, or so people thought, empty land. This gave rise over time, of course, to two things. I mean, the main language in Mindanao now is Cebuano. Of course, a lot of other languages are spoken as well, but that's the most common. The other was this brought the people, the newcomers, or the now what was becoming the new majority over time, into conflict. On the one hand, with the Muslims in Western Mindanao, who were felt under pressure, and that their lands were being taken over by these newcomers, and those eventually became sort of a war between Christians and Muslims. So it wasn't really seen that way originally. And the other was this conflict with the other, the existing non-Muslim peoples of Mindanao, and you still see that in the fact that people talk about Lumads. Lumad means indigenous people in Cebuano. And as though these are different people from your ordinary Filipino. Actually, they're not. I mean, Filipinos are all basically Austronesian with some added, influences. These people have been less influenced by the foreign, whether it's Spanish or it's American or whatever it is, influences. But they are somehow now treated as though they were akin to the Australian Aborigines, rather than being, the integral part of the Philippines. So there is an issue there that people don't actually write much about in the Philippines. But the fact that you're always reading about the problems with Lumads, it tells you something about this divide. I mean, it's not critical, and it probably will get less over time, but it's certainly a cause for the insurgency, communist insurgency still having some grip in parts of Mindanao. And I noticed that the new defense minister, appointed by Bongbong, his previous command was in Eastern Mindanao, and of course, Eastern Mindanao, that was where the NPA was most active in Mindanao. So, I'll just run through a few of the issues of today, which I think, I hope I've said enough about the history and how little has changed in some ways in the last 150 years. But the problems of today, First of all, agriculture. Philippines had, everybody knows, a high birth rate. But what's worse from the agricultural point of view is that its productivity in agriculture has actually been slower than any other country in Southeast Asia. So what do you get? You get a situation where, food prices are high, imports, rice, sugar, wheat, corn, all the staples are actually being imported on a large scale. Meanwhile, domestic prices are high. You have a tariff, 30% to 50% on rice imports, ditto on other grain imports. So as a result, the whole price structure through the Philippines is affected by this. Quite apart from the fact that there's a very high level of malnutrition among children in the Philippines. I mean, these are issues which you don't find anything like the same extent in other parts of Southeast Asia, except possibly Myanmar, but I can't speak to that. So that's one problem. The second problem is education. Philippines started off with American, educational guidance, unquote. So at an elementary level, it was, not bad, but it's, simply failed to make progress. And if you look at Philippine results in relative terms to other countries, not just in Asia, but around the world, it ranks fairly near the bottom in terms of, competence in mathematics and things like that. So that's a second problem, I think. The third one, we have this problem of identity. I mentioned the Lumad issue and whether people realize that they are in fact Malays, as Rizal kept telling them, you are Tagalog, you are Malay, right? Get that in your head. He didn't quite use those words, but I mean that's what he was trying to say. And yet, in California, where there's a very large number of Filipinos, they actually 50% of them, at least according to one book, one survey, identify as Latinos or Pacific Islanders rather than Asians. And that's an interesting comment on how they see themselves, or some, perhaps confusion. It also flows through to foreign policy. I mean, Philippine foreign policy is kind of, I use the phrase at sea. It really is. It's a complete mess. There's no consistency. There's no high level of people don't know about the Philippine foreign minister unless he makes some stupid remark about, Sabah being ours and things like that. And part of this is because there isn't sufficient sense of identity with the neighboring countries. Although there's so much similarity between the Philippines and Indonesia. I mean, the only thing that really divides them is religion. And actually, neither country is, superficially, they're all very religious, but actually, do people care that much about whether you're this or that or the other? I somewhat doubt it. So, that feeds through to, we've had all this vacillation about the South China Sea. First of all, you get a stunning, victory in the Court of Arbitration in The Hague, and then you throw it away. I mean, what sort of country is this? So there are problems which go back to this identity. I'll just say a few things about future strength. One is demography, which has been a problem for the Philippines too much. Actually, it will be an advantage in the future because almost every other country in the region is going to face of falling populations, aging populations. Labor export will continue. Philippines has some creative industries, has its BPO, which can be built on. It's probably less vulnerable to climate change than, say, Vietnam or Thailand or Indonesia. It has lots of resourceful individuals. We know that because they're all over the world. anybody with ambition gets out, well, a lot of them. So, if you can keep those people at home, you can improve your country very rapidly, because there is initiative, there is adaptability. It is an open society. I mean, there's a lot of nasty things go on. There's a lot of corruption, and the judicial system is corrupted as well. But it's open. Philippines is always open to outsiders, just as Filipinos migrate and are very beneficial to the places to which they migrate. So anyway, I'm quite critical about the Philippines, but I do so from a point of view of disappointment and knowing that it has underperformed. And everybody in the Philippines knows that the country has underperformed. And the reason I wrote this book, I was just trying to explain to myself the history and the background of why things are as they are. Now, I hope that's of some use. But anyway, I'll stop here, so please ask some questions.
Thank you. That was a great tour de force. We got about 10 minutes or so for questions. Before I open it up, let me just ask one or two. You mentioned briefly the South China Sea issue, but how would you historically and then today talk about the Philippines' relations with China? Because when I was there, I actually noticed that a lot of the elite, in addition to being mestizo, they were also Chinese.
Well, it's certainly true of the business community, but I mean that's not necessarily true of the population at large. And obviously, there's also a degree of suspicion of China. I mean, if you look at surveys, China is not popular, and there's always a sort of a sense in some areas that particularly in sort of leftist circles and so on, that the Chinese are all capitalists and are out to screw us, Filipinos and so on. So it's I mean it's a problem in Southeast Asia generally, that there can be a gulf between the majority of the population and the business elite for ethnic reasons. Well, the Philippines is sort of still pretty well integrated. A lot of these, so-called Chinese families are actually, the Cojuangcos, Quinos, Cojuangcos. I mean, these are all sort of, mestizos from way back. The problem maybe more lies of local, one or two kind of people who've migrated relatively recently have managed to get themselves very rich. I mean, the biggest case was Lucio Tan, who got this tobacco monopoly from Marcos, and now controls, the second largest bank, Philippine Airlines, and heaven knows what else. So there are things like that, but there are also the survival, and I devote quite a lot of this book actually to the families of the oligopolies, and a lot of them are Spanish or semi-Spanish, mestizos and so on. People from Lopez, and people from the old sugar belt in Panay and Negros.
And what about just one word on the Catholic Church? I'm wondering if they're kind of losing their grip a bit, because there have been these kind of evangelical churches coming along and others.
Yeah, I mean, I think, the Catholic Church has been losing out to evangelicals, TV, evangelists, and I mean, there's all kinds of people out there, and people, religion, as I use the phrase in the book, people wear it on their sleeve, but I mean, it doesn't mean to say that that everybody believes in God, but if you believe in one sort of God or the other, it doesn't seem to matter a great deal. And,
Sure. I see a question right here in the front. Please show me your hand if you have a question as well.
Philip, give us some reason for hope. It's the same old families ruling as they all have done. They still are doing the same old thing. Give us hope.
Well, I mean, this is what I was trying to do a little bit at the end. I mean, obviously, the search for change in the sort of social and political order. I mean, it's difficult to see where that comes from, but at the same time, people know that it's necessary. I mean, you know, here we have a situation with Bong Bong. You know, he's married to an Araneta in another, you know, talk about old rich families. And his sister's married to another Araneta, right? And they're all related to, you know, Rojas, who was the candidate, you know, who was defeated by Duterte. I mean, it goes on and on and on. So, yes, there needs to be somehow, you know, some political change, which also would result in social change, because, you know, obviously you get vested interests protecting themselves naturally. I mean, that's what vested interests do. But now, where this comes from, I don't know. I mean, the problem with the left is that it's always been either part of it's been too extreme, yeah. So you got the NPA, and you get, you know, very ideological communists, and then you get the sort of moderate people. Sometimes get accused of being, you know, they have this what they call under Duterte red tagging. So even moderate socialists will get tagged as red, and you know, subject to, you know, all kinds of problems, including, you know, in some cases, you know, assassination, which happens quite a lot not in Manila, but in Negros or anywhere you try to farmers try to organize. And this all goes back to, you know, the political power base, so that which doesn't change, even though, you know, there are elections at every level: president, you know, House of Representatives, Senate, provincial, you know, city, barrio, I mean, barangay. You know, it's.
You know, yes, one here. Oh, yes, you do have one. She changed her mind. There's a microphone there, please.
What do you think of the state of the press freedom in the Philippines, and how has social media and disinformation contributed to the present state of the Philippines?
I must say that, you know, the influence of social media has been enormous. I mean, people do not read newspapers. People do not, by and large anyway, don't even probably watch as much television as they used to. You know, social media is the main medium for news, and of course a lot of that news is rubbish, and as we know, and Bong Bong has, you know, has been very adept. I mean, using a lot of money, of course, at actually persuading people that, you know, his father's regime was an era of prosperity and stability and, you know, glorification of the Filipino people. I mean, we know it's wrong, but, you know, it's, you know, new generations, they can't remember, so, you know, they read this stuff and they, oh, it must be true. You know? So, yeah, press freedom, yeah, I mean, you get, if I compare with some other countries, it's still actually not bad. I mean, the dangers are you get assassinated occasionally, or you get, you know, like Maria Ressa, you get harassed and threatened with jail and so on, but you probably don't actually end up in jail. So, you know, relative to some other places, I mean, it's worse than, say, Indonesia, but it's no worse than, well, it's different from Malaysia. I mean, everywhere's a bit different, but yeah, I mean, you know, it's not the biggest problem.
One question here in the front.
You had talked about the education level has been falling down, and which I don't know, but apparently the export of healthcare, medical and healthcare professionals remains the biggest export, and is one of the most sought after professions all over the world. Then how can you explain how they can manage to maintain the standard of education on healthcare? If the good people have already left the country, who is going to do the training for them? And why are they still being trusted?
Well, I mean, the health care training has been actually promoted as a sort of export item. So, people wanted to get into it because then they could get a job overseas. Now, I'm not saying that the whole education system is screwed up. I'm just talking about the average level of education and the very low level of achievement of the mass of people who go to government schools. Now, obviously, there's a lot of private schools. It's a very, it's very sort of informal but very class-ridden in a sense. I mean, most of the helpers here in Hong Kong, they're spending money to send their kid to school, private school, rather than to the public education. And that tells you something about the standard of public education.
Let me. Oh, sorry. There's one over there. Right here in the middle.
Regarding the security situation in Mindanao, you mentioned that religion is sort of something that is worn on the sleeve, and I think that's quite an interesting point to make regarding the Islamist insurgencies down there. I mean, over the years, you've had movements of various affiliation from Al-Qaeda to ISIS, but those affiliations have always seemed quite skin deep. So would you say that's something more of an indigenous or regionalism related issue, and how do you see the future of Islamist movements in the South?
Yeah, I think the Islamist movements are more a reflection of other issues. I mean, you've got this sort of long-held sense of separate identity and feeling that people were oppressed by the encroachment of Christians and by Manila and so on and so forth. And you have the tribal issues. I mean, the group issues. I mean, in Sulu, the Tausubs, and for complicated reasons, you are dealing with separate local ethnic groups. You're also dealing with the fact that perhaps not so much in Sulu, but certainly in Lanao and in Maguindanao. I mean, you have this feudal system. I mean, you have people who literally own villages, and they run all of the politics. And some of them will go along with the Islamists for a bit, and then they'll turn and so on. It's just opportunism. And you get these family feuds, like 10 years ago now, whatever, when Ampatuan, who was the big family in Maguindanao, it assassinated 36 people, including a lot of journalists, who were supporting or going to the support of a rival family. So there's a lot of mixed issues there, and hopefully maybe this Bangsamoro deal will stick. I don't, the Al Qaeda sort of all those Islamic links are really more for show than reflecting any fundamental beliefs.
One more here.
Just quickly, in your research, did you uncover connections between the elites in the Philippines with elites in other parts of the world? I'm thinking particularly US, Mexico, Spain, Lebanon, and so on. The reason why I'm asking is I did read a while ago that the Phalangist militias in Lebanon had connections with similar organizations in the Philippines way back when.
I'm not aware that, most, leading families in Philippines have got connections of one sort or another in the US, mainly in California, but I don't think it's particularly political, no. There's nothing, I'm not aware of anything where there's any obvious link.
Okay. I want to make sure you get one more over here. One or two. Okay, one. Check shirt.
Hi. I would like to ask, there's been talk in recent years of a switch to the federalism form of government. Do you think that would bring some sort of change? Because you've been saying that it's always been the same for the past 150 years. Is that something that you think would be beneficial?
Actually, personally, I think not. I mean, the Philippines has an existing problem of governance in that it's centralized in terms of budget, in terms of money raising and so on. The implementation is very much within local government and provincial, and is fragmented, and as I said, the bureaucracy is quite weak. So that leaves things in the hands of local power groups, politicians, and so on. A federal system. I mean, if there was only a few federal states, I mean, there were sort of 4 or something like that. I mean, maybe, but not the sort of federalism where you've got 20 states or something like that. It'll just be the same. It'll just be different. One family which at present controls one province will end up controlling 6 provinces. That's all. I mean, I don't. Federalism itself is not. I mean, federalism may be part of a way forward politically, but it has to be combined with other things. And in fact, the first thing is it needs to be combined with something which is already in the Constitution, but which has never been enacted, which is to disbar dynasties. I mean, it's in the Constitution, but they've never enacted the law which will actually stop dynasties from forming. Yeah? So, I mean, if they did that, but they won't, because it's
all dynasties.
They're all dynasties. So I mean, so the question is there some outside force, or is there some, I mean, in another country you might think that, I mean, if you compare, I mean, not perhaps today, but I mean, if you compare, and here I go back to a comparison between Marcos and Suharto. I mean, Suharto was a genuine military person. He knew actually how to get things done on the ground, which is why his dictatorship was rather more successful than Marcos's. Yeah. Now the question is, are you going to have a military regime in the Philippines? It's kind of unlikely. The military is small. The military doesn't have much. It doesn't have a particularly big reputation, and the military has mainly been engaged in fighting other Filipinos. Yeah. So yeah, it's. But you never know. Something might happen, but which will induce change. I mean, there's always hope that some spark, which will induce change. I don't think it's bong, but anyway.
Let me use my moderator's privilege for the last question. One of the common conversations in Hong Kong, unfortunately, is if we have to leave here, where do we go? People talk about Singapore. Some people say maybe Thailand. People say Taiwan. Nope, don't go over to Taiwan. The Philippines is never in that conversation. And it's an English-speaking country. It's a big country. They've got the advantages of a population. Call centers are based there. Why aren't they ever in that conversation?
Well, actually, I think they are. But, there's a lot of people who actually do. I mean, maybe it's because they don't necessarily encourage it, but it's actually very easy. And, for a foreigner to live in comfort in the Philippines, it's actually easier probably than in Thailand. It's probably less secure than in, say, Malaysia, but, it's not I don't think that's I mean, you just go to a Longapo, it's full of former American servicemen.
So we should start looking for property in the Philippines.
Well, you can always rent.
Well, I want to give a big round of applause here to Philip Bowring. Also, you can't leave without an FCC gift bag, which will get you out of trouble if you're ever on the streets of Hong Kong. We hope.
Thank you.
And also, you're going to stick around and sign some books.
Yeah, sure, yeah.
Their books are over there. They're for sale. The Pieces of a Jigsaw State, pick one up. You'll understand everything you need to know about the Philippines. And then thank you for coming. I went a little bit over 2 o'clock because I know it's August. You don't really want to go back to your office now. It's fine. September, we're going to stop at 2 sharp. Thank you very much, Philip.
All right.